Hello, I'm Thane Rosenbaum, sitting in for Mark Golub. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past several months, you know that the midterm elections are soon upon us on November 6th. Americans will be going to the polls in one of the most highly charged elections in recent history. With Republicans controlling both the House and the Senate, the question is whether a blue wave will give Congress to the Democrats, and will Republicans be able to maintain their control in the Senate? Traditionally, 70% of American Jewish voters vote Democratic, and a recent poll by the Mellman Group, a firm which specializes in polling and focus groups for Democratic candidates and progressive organizations, shows that 75% of American Jews disapprove of President Trump and therefore plan to vote Democratic. This includes those Democrats who say they care about Israel, but also say this will not move them to vote Republican. Historically, Democrats tend to care more about domestic social issues, such as health care, gun safety, racial and economic justice, immigration, and women's reproductive freedom. Jewish Republicans will more often include pro-Israel policies on their list of priorities, a more hawkish foreign policy in general, along with religious liberty. For some Democrats who identify as strongly pro-Israel, and who support many of the policies President Trump has implemented in his first 2 years in office, especially with regard to the state of Israel, they are faced with a dilemma. There are also many Jews who have a history of voting Democratic who are uneasy about the growth of the far left in the Democratic Party, which is often pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. Here with me to discuss the upcoming midterm elections are two special guests. First, we have Halie Soifer, is the first executive director of the Jewish Democratic Council of America. Halie served in the Obama administration as a foreign policy expert after having served as the Florida Jewish Vote Director during Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. Halie has worked extensively on national security issues, including those related to Israel, and has served as a liaison to the Jewish community and its affiliated organizations. Dr. Bruce Abramson is a senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research and a contributor to the Haim Solomon Center for News and Public Policy. Bruce is active with the Republican Jewish Coalition and has worked with the Republican Platforms Committee draft on its pro-Israel positioning. He has also defended White House and administration personnel from defamatory attacks from the Jewish left. Welcome to the both of you. It's really wonderful having you here. Let's start with you, Halie. So do you expect a surge in this blue wave? Is that something we should be expecting?
We are very optimistic about the midterm elections. That is because we have phenomenal candidates running in the Democratic Party, the likes of which we have not seen before, including an unprecedented number of women and veterans. And we are confident that not only due to the strength of our candidates, but also due to what we see as a rejection of President Trump in many communities, including the Jewish community, we are confident that Democrats will be victorious on November 6th.
Normally in a midterm election, we saw this with President Clinton, with George W. Bush, and with Barack Obama. The party that's in the White House, in the executive branch, oftentimes loses control of the legislative branches. That's historically what's happened. But there is always a Trump effect. Everything seems to be different with President Trump, right? The paradigm shift is always different. Conventional wisdom doesn't mean anything. And I'm wondering whether the two of you can respond to, it seems to me you touched on it in a different way. To you, the Trump effect represents the possibility of a blowback against the president, which would actually make it a much more conventional midterm where the Democrats would be able to retake control, at least of the House. I'm wondering whether you think that in this instance, we might not see that. I know this is not something you're happy to hear, but that Trump would just simply defy the expectations yet again.
I believe that Democrats will win in November, in the House especially, and that is, again, in part due to the strength of our candidates, but also as a rejection of President Trump. And in the Jewish community specifically, you mentioned the nonpartisan poll that was done of 800 Jewish voters. What we saw in that poll was that 68% of those polled identified themselves as Democrats. But as you mentioned, about 75% said they would vote for the Democratic candidate. That means that some support for Democrats will come from independents and Republicans. And we know that there's overwhelming disapproval of Trump's policies, both domestic and foreign policy, and that rejection of Trump is going to lead to support for Democrats beyond our base.
Bruce, I don't think you agree with this, but what do you think there's a Trump effect here that could actually work to his advantage?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, certainly if you're talking nationwide, I think that we have a very interesting and new set of circumstances. I think that when President Obama was in office, the polls consistently showed that Americans liked him and disliked his policies. And in fact, if you look at the elections between 2008 and 2016, that's exactly what you see. When Barack Obama was on the ballot, the Democrats did well, and when he was not on the ballot, they did very poorly. With President Trump, I think the polls seem to show the opposite. They show that the American public is very happy with what he's done. The economy is booming. We are doing well on foreign policy. The American public likes the job he's doing. A lot of people, he rubs the wrong way. He's got a big personality. You would expect that. Within the Jewish community, I think that it's important, as you outlined it, I think that there are two voting blocks you want to look at. One is there are people, and this is the larger of the two, there are Jewish voters who do not vote on Jewish issues. I mean, there are Jewish voters who cannot stand up and say, here's something that's important to me because I'm Jewish. If I were non-Jewish, it would be of lesser importance to me. I take the opposite side. And in fact, if you suggested that they view something as a Jew, they would see it as parochial or special pleading. Those people, I agree, they are overwhelmingly Democrat. I'm not sure that they're more overwhelmingly Democrat than they would be if you accounted for zip code where they live, education level, and income. Maybe they are, but not by much. Then you've got the block of people who are fine to say, yeah, there are issues that interest me because I'm a Jew, and they will vote heavily for the Republicans as they voted for President Trump.
What about the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings? Clearly in the Senate, it has been to the advantage of perhaps in West Virginia, Manchin might actually retake his seat because he voted in favor of Kavanaugh. And Heitkamp in North Carolina might have taken a risk in voting against him. From your perspective as a Democratic analyst, would we say that in this instance the confirmation hearings didn't have the effect that the Democrats had hoped that it would because of the Me Too movement and the survivor testimony issues, that we didn't actually get the advantages that we should have at the end, that it might have, oddly enough, galvanized red states even further?
Well, I don't think that we will fully see the effects until we go to the polls on November 6th. However,
do you think that North Carolina and West Virginia are still in play?
I do. But where I really think that Kavanaugh will have an effect is on the women's vote. And I do believe that women are going to play an outsized role in this election, both in terms of turnout and in terms of those who will be elected. We are going to see an unprecedented number of female candidates. The Kavanaugh hearings for many reasons, both in terms of what Kavanaugh stands for, in terms of potentially voting against reproductive rights, but also in terms of course, the stories that came out with regard to Dr. Ford, and the way he composed himself in terms of the arrogance that he displayed in front of the Senate, and just his disposition in general, I think absolutely galvanized women to support Democrats. And we again saw that in our polling in the Jewish community. The #1 issue, 90% of those polled said that the candidate's position with regard to Supreme Court nominees was the top priority for them. And I believe a lot of that is driven by women and their disapproval of Judge Kavanaugh's positions and the way he handled himself during his confirmation.
Now, Bruce, that sounds like something that we might not have heard in prior elections, where Jewish voters are responding to the Supreme Court appointments themselves. I mean, I can't imagine any other time in American history where Jewish Americans were galvanized by that issue, the issue of the Supreme Court appointments. I don't know if you agree with what Halie just said, but I know that it did seem that the Republicans, that there was momentum for the Democrats going to the midterms, as there should have been, as might have been predicted. But in fact, the confirmation hearings produced a kind of aftershock that might have yet again galvanized red state Republicans further.
The way that those hearings were conducted were a political disaster for the Democrats. For the simple reason that, as you said, going into them, this election was going to be a referendum on Donald Trump.
Right.
And the Democrats have spent a long time demonizing him, and they've got their anger, and they've got their people riled up. And you never want anything to be a referendum on you, because then it's you versus some hypothetical that I can think of. What the Kavanaugh hearings did was they took the elections away from being a referendum on President Trump and towards being a referendum on the resistance. And all of a sudden you have Americans saying, you know, forget the president, forget whether I like him. Do I really want these people to be promoting street riots and attacking folks in restaurants and accosting them in elevators? I mean, what we saw clutching at the doors of the Supreme Court, we saw coming from the left, from the Democrats, was an embarrassment. And what Cory Booker did was an embarrassment. What Dianne Feinstein did to Christine Blasey Ford was cruel. I mean, this was a woman who said, most important thing to me is keeping my confidentiality. And the Democrats just destroyed her. They put her on TV. I mean, you compare the cruelty that we saw coming from the Democrats to the genteel consideration you saw coming from Chuck Grassley. There's no comparison. It was just sadistic.
Halie, I must have you respond to that because,
Right.
because I'm sure you want to. Do you think that what the final impression that was left in the American public is that you have this righteous moral indignation by the Democratic left, and that they are in fact the cause of a coarsening of the political culture because of a radicalization? Because the way that Bruce is describing it is that what was embarrassing was the behavior of the righteousness, the indignation, the outrage. I find this whole thing very interesting because both sides point to each other when it comes to the expression of outrage, right? I mean, from your perspective, the way people talked about judicial temperament with respect to the confirmation, handling his comportment, Judge Kavanaugh's comportment. So that became an issue. Now the issue is, well, you know, yelling at people in restaurants, that's really become the issue. How would you respond to this?
Well, first, I would say before we praise Chuck Grassley or any of the Republicans in terms of their demeanor at that hearing, let's acknowledge that they didn't trust themselves enough to question the witness, so they had to hire a female prosecutor to do it for them.
Well, she didn't get to talk very much. I'm just saying, we hardly know this woman.
They didn't want to question her, so they outsourced that to someone else.
But wait, but they didn't do that because of optics, right?
I'm not going to assume I know exactly why they did it, but the facts speak for themselves.
Just so for just for the JBS audience, just to be clear, I suspect that what we're talking about here is whether or not the Republicans didn't want a retelling of the Anita Hill hearings, because in that instance you had, in some cases, the same senators, males, forcefully questioning a woman about sexual history. And so there may have been, some of it may just be, let us get a female prosecutor because then we can't be accused of a kind of chauvinistic mistreatment.
Perhaps. It could also be because there are no women on the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Republican side. Right. Of course, there are 2 women on. So
you're saying first, I didn't interrupt you, Jamal. So you said, well, first let's discuss the fact that they didn't even want to do the questioning. And then there are other issues, right?
Sure. I mean, when we talk about this issue of street riots, I really don't know what street riots you're talking about. I think in terms of the Jewish community, we're concerned about neo-Nazis marching in our streets. And we've seen it no less than 2 times since President Trump has come to office.
Okay, but that's not, is there any connection between that and the confirmation hearings? We'll definitely get to what you want to talk about, but I just want to know.
I think the allegation that somehow the so-called resistance is rioting in the street has no basis in reality. And what I'm concerned about are neo-Nazis marching in our streets that feel legitimized by this president.
Both of you then think that that Democrats, both and Republicans, there was a benefit to the confirmation process that may have ultimately helped them for the purposes of the midterm elections?
I think that we will see an increase in voter turnout. The average in terms of midterm voter turnout in the American electorate is
somewhat on the heels of this.
I think women will be going to the polls, and what we hear from many of our candidates is that they are having a surge of independent women, especially maybe women who have previously voted for Trump or for Republicans, that were so disgusted, not only by the Kavanaugh hearings, but also by the treatment of families at our borders, tearing apart of families. There have been so many issues over the past few months that really have called into question our values. Certainly the Kavanaugh hearing was one, but it's not the only one that will, I believe, drive women, Jews, and others to the polls.
And Bruce, you actually think that this might have awakened, catalyzed Republican voters who might have been apathetic and somehow walked away from the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings once again energized because of this issue?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, you had, this is particularly true among Republican or conservative voters who don't particularly like President Trump and are sitting around thinking, you know, where do I want my support to go? Do I want to increase a check on him by giving him a Democratic House? I think that it drove them all to the point where they said, you know, if a man as decent, as checked out, as studied by the FBI over the years, as Brett Kavanaugh can be attacked and defamed and have stories made up about him this way, maybe it's not so bad to have a fighter in the White House. The whole notion that has split the Republican Party of people saying, oh, well, you know, they're going after President Trump because, you know, look at who he's been for 40 years in the public eye. If we put up a more genteel, say a Mitt Romney, he wouldn't have been attacked like that. But if Brett Kavanaugh can get attacked, anybody can get attacked. It's just making things up.
I wonder from both of your perspectives whether this ongoing partisan polarization, the divisiveness we're seeing in American political process, has made it more difficult for moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. That what plays better today is the more extreme, which is very unusual, right? Because you know, we learned from President Clinton, triangulating is the key. We learned from President Nixon, right, the Southern strategy. Finding ways to incorporate more moderate voters has been the singular achievement of those who've succeeded to the White House. This election seems different because it seems that we're even hearing, and we'll talk about this soon, Democratic Socialists have now emerged. You can't even imagine that during the Cold War, that anyone would want the word socialist associated with the word democracy in their campaign. But today, I'm wondering whether part of this is because of this divide is so polarized that it's actually making it more difficult for more traditional moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans. Are you seeing that?
We certainly see it on the Republican side because what we have seen in the past years is a large number of Republicans choosing not to run for re-election. You see it with Jeff Flake or Bob Corker and others from the House.
And for you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for you and from what you've gleaned from them, it's completely related, traceable to the coarsening of the process itself.
Sure, Jeff Flake wrote a whole book about it.
Right.
I mean, it is clear that those Republicans who want to either defy the president or say something critical of the president will not only be berated publicly, including on Twitter by the president, but they feel there's no place for them left in Washington because we have seen an unprecedented number, I believe no less than 6, choose to retire. You don't see the same thing on the Democratic side, and I believe that's because Republicans feel that certainly Trump has taken over this party, taken it in the direction you are talking about, to the right, and there isn't a place perhaps for moderates.
What do you think about that, Bruce? I mean, you actually think that Halie is right, that you're seeing it just simply by the number of open seats, by people withdrawing from the process because they don't want to be attacked on Twitter by their own president. Now, I would say, in response to what Halie said, well, you're not seeing it from Democrats because they're not the party in power right now. So they have less of a reason not to run. In fact, if anything, President Trump has energized the Democratic Party in all categories. But I'm wondering, though, whether the moderate Democrat is going to have a problem. She's saying The real problem is on the Republican side, not on the Democratic side.
I mean, one of the things that happens is the political parties in this country change. Okay? 20 years ago, there were certain things. For example, you mentioned religious freedom. Right. 20 years ago, the Religious Freedom, actually 25 years ago, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was sponsored in Congress by Ted Kennedy in the Senate, Chuck Schumer in the House, and signed to much fanfare by President Bill Clinton. Right. It was a voice vote in both the Senate and the House.
And now it's a red state issue.
Now it is now to support it is considered to be part of the far right.
Right.
So the issues change. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration was proud of WTO. It was proud of NAFTA. Right. It was proud of the crime bill. It was proud of some of the regulations it put forward. None of those things were acceptable by the 2016 Democratic primary and Democratic platform.
So to you, this is an example of a leftward shift in the Democratic Party.
The parties change. Right. The Democratic Party moved very hard and very far to the left. Now, there is no way that one party can move without the other one moving as well. I've seen scatter plots of where people voted based on the last presidential election. The Democrats are very far to the left. Almost the entire center is taken up by Republican voters. So it's really, I would say that if you ask me about, first of all, if you ask me about coarsening, I would say that there has indeed been a coarsening, and it's not good for the country. If you ask me about moderates, I'd have to ask how you define moderate first, because the parties are changing, and what used to be a centrist matter of consensus is now considered far right.
But would you seem to be saying that if there are moderate voters, they're more likely to be Republicans now?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that should be if you're right, that should be very scary to Halie, to say that if you're in the center, you're going to find more common ground with Republicans than with Democrats.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, if you take moderate views like a growing economy is a good thing and we're better off when a lot of people have jobs and we want America's interest represented abroad, we want somebody who'll keep the country safe. I mean, these should not be Republican issues. These should be American issues. They've become Republican issues.
So Halie, given what Bruce just said, it sounds what he's saying is that issues that were once stalwart, staunch issues for the Democratic Party have now become more mainstream for Republicans because there's been a dramatic shift left for Democrats. And so that for those issues that were once, you know, obvious for Democrats, now they won't find the same home in a moderate Democratic Party. Do you think that's true? Do you think that there has been too much of a shift left in the Democratic Party?
I really don't. I see, again, the challenge on the Republican side. Trump's policies, both on domestic and foreign policy issues, have been completely erratic. So Bruce mentioned trade agreements. Even on trade, this president obviously has adopted a protectionist policy. He's imposing tariffs without even fully understanding what a tariff is. And he is essentially abandoning our long history of free trade. So I think the Republican Party is really challenged to keep up with what has been a very erratic policy. And it's been enough for many of the Republicans, as I mentioned, just to have enough and leave.
So Bruce, you mentioned that you too agree that the coarsening of our political culture is not something you obviously support, and you're aware of it, and it's of deep concern. We can all agree on that. But Halie mentioned before, she said, look, I want to tell you what I'm interested in. I'm interested in neo-Nazis marching. That's where I think we should be interested. And she said that twice, and I think we should at least respond to that.
Sure.
There are people who believe that it's precisely this coarsened culture of invective and insult and Twitter rants, the kind of, sort of intemperate behavior, impulsive behavior in the White House. That and, of course, post-Charlottesville, there are good people on both sides, that might have encouraged, normalized the alternative right to express themselves in more anti-Semitic, racist ways, which would have been completely, impossible to have done in earlier administrations. Can we at least, do we have a response to Halie
Sure.
when she makes this observation?
I think there are two issues here. First of all, there is a tiny fringe movement of white supremacists in this country. Everybody despises them. The Democrats hate them because they're white.
And they haven't grown.
No. The Democrats hate them because they're white, and the Republicans hate them because they're supremacists. Republicans are opposed to all the supremacist movements. I spent years, particularly during the second term of Obama, terrified watching attorneys general and presidents encouraging street riots. There was a movement that arose called Black Lives Matter that objects when you say all lives matter. I mean, these are racist movements. The idea that you could push identity politics, that you could push a black movement and not expect a white counter movement is absurd. This was dangerous, and this was going on for 4 years. Now, most of the folks that you're talking about are clowns who get press because the press wants to go cover them. You get people out there who, if they call up the local news or the local police and say, a bunch of my friends are going to go create havoc in the street, everybody says that's not a big deal. If they say, we'll create havoc in the street and draw swastikas, now we can get coverage of stuff. It is a tiny fringe movement. There is no support. There has been no support from President Trump. There's been no support from the White House. Everybody has repudiated them. Everybody has distanced themselves from them. You know, what they want to do in terms of buying bumper stickers or voting, I mean, unfortunately, when you've got a country with over 300 million people in it, some of them are not very nice people.
Halie, what would you say about the Black Lives Matter point that Bruce raised? He seemed to be saying, look, this had an anti-white feel to it and also a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli position to it. Nobody, no one in the press, no one really wanted to talk about that. The Jewish community was somewhat muted when it came to that. That, too, is an extremist group. You seem to be upset about the neo-Nazis marching. Did you have equal ambivalence or disagreement with Black Lives Matter?
Well, I think again, it's important to talk about the issues facing the Jewish community today, and I really have to respond with regard to neo-Nazis. They are not tiny nor fringe, and there hasn't been a distancing from this president. This is the issue facing the Jewish community, I believe, in the polls, as we go to the polls in just a few days. Going back to Charlottesville, we saw the president equivocate in condemning Nazis. He took back a statement in which he tried to take a step back. He couldn't decide where he was. That's not a distancing.
Remember, there was also the David Duke during the election. Not Nazis,
it has been ongoing with this president. And in terms of the size, what we have seen an unprecedented number of candidates who are affiliated with either white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or Holocaust deniers run for Congress this election cycle. That is not tiny. It is unprecedented. As of July, there were no less than 9 of them. We also have some sitting members of Congress who themselves sympathize with these movements. They are all Republicans. Now, did these movements exist before the Trump administration? Of course. But now people who associate with these movements feel legitimized to the point where they believe they will now run for Congress, and we haven't seen the kind of condemnation that Bruce was referencing, certainly not from the president.
And you're saying it's an atmosphere that was created from the White House.
I believe neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and Holocaust deniers feel both legitimized and emboldened because they believe they have an ally in this president.
Bruce, Haley's telling us this is no fringe movement, and you can tell this from what she's saying is that, you know, these are now candidates for higher office who are running on supremacist positions. You may be saying that they may not win, but
well, they won't.
But they're out there. How do you respond to that?
So first of all, I mean, the problem of fringe candidates running stems from a strategic error that the Republicans made. And that is that the Republicans did not bother to contest a lot of safe Democratic seats. They didn't go out. They could have recruited somebody. They didn't go out and recruit candidates. They simply left the slot open.
So a nut job can walk in.
Yeah, a nut job can walk in and sign up and win an uncontested primary and get the Republican line. The Republican Party has repudiated all of these candidates. It's backed away from all of them. It's put no money behind them. None of them are going to win. What you've got on the Democratic side is some real Jew haters who will win. You've got people who are rabidly anti-Israel. You've got people who are anti-Jewish, and they will win. And they are being touted, and many of them won hotly contested primaries, some of them with the backing of the party, some of them only gained the backing of the party after they won. But this is the wave of the Democratic future. And I also want to correct something. President Trump did not equivocate after Charlottesville. He brought up Charlottesville, or Charlottesville was brought to him at three different press conferences in the space of a week. The first time he said something that is absolutely critical and needs to be repeated over and over again. He condemned violence on all sides. What happened in Charlottesville was there was a small demonstration concerning whether or not the town should take down Confederate statues.
Yes, but the marchers were reciting, "Jews will not replace us."
Yes.
They may have shown up initially, ostensibly.
No.
But when it came time to chant, it just so happens they chanted something not about General Lee.
Yeah.
They chanted something about Jews. So
No,
all of a sudden, General Lee didn't know that many Jews. So obviously there's no real connection there. They came for something else.
Absolutely.
Right.
They came for the press.
Right.
They came for the media. They came for attention.
Right.
There was, I mean, you have two different things going on there. One is you had a small municipal issue. From what I understand, looking at the polls, a slight majority of people who lived in Charlottesville wanted to keep the statues, and a small majority on the city council wanted to get rid of them. And that's when you have a small municipal demonstration. You then had two groups of outsiders who decided to take it over and flood Charlottesville with people itching, with people
And
antsy
that's
for
what
a
the
fight.
cameras picked up.
That was what the cameras picked up. That was what President Trump condemned, and he was right to do so. Then it was brought back to him that said, well, aren't you going to make a special condemnation of Nazis? And he said yes. Then it was brought up to him again, and he said there were some fine people on both sides. I would not have emphasized that. Turns out that it was factually true. In fact, several days after he said that, I read an article came from the Charlottesville newspaper that talked about two groups of veterans, one on the right and one on the left, that had gone to do security at the event. When they saw that violence was breaking out, they dropped their political disputes and worked together as veterans to keep everybody safe. I don't have any problems with describing those as fine people on both sides. I think they are. Again, it's not what I would have emphasized. I wish he would have stuck to his original line, decrying the violence on all sides, and not making much of a distinction between, folks wearing white hoods and swastikas and folks wearing blackface masks.
Well, let me go back to Halie with another group that some people think are not really so fringe. And I wonder whether, given your position as a long-term and distinguished Jewish political analyst and operative for the Democratic Party, whether the movements that we're seeing on campus on the progressive side, which have oftentimes anti-Israel, sometimes pro-DDS feelings, whether that actually is not a fringe group that makes it difficult for Jews to embrace the Democratic Party, certainly on the progressive left.
Well, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, the organization which I am leading, is opposed to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. There's no question. And we have seen a rise on college campuses in pro-BDS movements, and this is of concern. It is something that we are looking at closely. However, going back to what Bruce was doing in terms of relitigating the events of Charlottesville, I found that very sad, actually, to not acknowledge.
It's very clear to you.
It is very clear, and to not acknowledge, if we're really going to try to equate both sides, as President Trump did, that actually someone was killed on one side. There was a woman killed on one side and not the other. And the neo-Nazis were marching, "Jews will not replace us." And for the Jewish community, we know as a fact, this is not just speculation, that left them feeling as though this president is not with them. And we polled this issue. 70% of Jews disapprove with the way President Trump has handled the issue of anti-Semitism, whether it was that event or later other marches in Washington, D.C., we've had at least one other, or the fact that neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and Holocaust deniers are running for Congress, or perhaps the increased desecrations that we've seen across the country in Jewish sites. So we know this to be a fact, and we know that the Jewish community doesn't agree with the views that Bruce espoused.
So let me take my question to you now with respect to the progressive left. Is this something that concerns you when you see the progressive left, whether it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the acknowledgement of a kind of democratic socialist movement that is sort of very wishy-washy on the idea of the creation of a Palestinian state, or maybe even a one-state solution. Do you think that there's a legitimate concern there for Jews in particular, and whether the Trump administration has handled them correctly? Because it's clear that Halie is saying the Trump administration has not handled neo-Nazis correctly. But have they taken a declarative statement with respect to what would be sensitive for many Jews, the movements of the progressive democratic left?
I mean, progressivism is an anti-Jewish hate movement. I mean, there is no other way to say it.
When you hear the word, that's what you hear.
They are not wishy-washy on Israel. They are anti-Israel. I mean, there is no other way to say it. Now, you know, has the White House dealt with them appropriately? I don't know how people think the White House deals with them. I mean, there are political factions in this country that don't like the president. One of the great things about America is there's always a third of the country that says the president is terrible. Doesn't matter who the president is. Doesn't matter what his policies are. You know, they're always there. These are not people who support the president, and they will keep answering polls the same way. They'll say they don't like the president. They'll say they don't like his policies. They say they don't like where he stands on Israel. They'll say they don't like where he stands on North Korea. They'll say they don't like what he's doing with the economy.
But are the progressive left more, in your mind, more of a fringe or less of a fringe than the neo-Nazis?
Yeah, I mean, the neo-Nazis, I mean, these organizations have dozens of members, no clout, no support, nothing. The press likes to play them up because they put on a good show. And you get a collaboration of the media with a couple of showmen like Richard Spencer, who's a showman. The progressives are taking over the Democratic Party. Progressivism is an ascendant, it's an ascendant ideology, and the Democratic Party is now split into true believers and those who really do know a lot better, but they're afraid of taking on their party base.
Speaking of which, let's talk about this. The problem that I think you have, and it's a complicated one, is that the traditional Jewish allies on the left have taken much more stridently declarative, openly hostile positions toward Israel. The African American, obviously the Black Lives Movement, the gay rights movement, feminism. And we had one, Linda Sarsour said that feminism is antithetical to Zionism, right? So we've seen examples of that march in Chicago where Jewish people, those carrying the Israeli flag, were kicked out of that movement. So that you're seeing this tremendous infighting among the Democratic left, and that the infighting has a lot to do with Jewish support for Israel and a kind of strident, almost militancy, to remove any, this is what intersectionality is about on campus, that essentially all marginalized groups share a common oppressor. And so we don't even ask the question, what would be the life of gay rights in a Palestinian country? I mean, it's sort of laughable. What would feminism look like in a Palestinian country? It's laughable. And yet on campus, we see time and time again that women, feminists, gay rights supporters are aligning themselves with Students for Justice in Palestine because it's all part of the intersectional progressive left. You just heard what Bruce said. To him, the word progressive says anti-Semitism. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely do not agree with that. I also want to avoid us speaking in hyperbole and generalizing. Again, let's talk about the facts. There are 468 Democrats running for Congress this cycle. 3 of them have publicly stated views on Israel with which Jewish Democrats, the Jewish Democratic Council of America certainly, does not agree. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez running in New York, Ilhan Omar running in Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib running in Detroit have all said different things with regard to Israel that we don't believe are aligned with our values as a pro-Israel and progressive organization.
But it's only 3 candidates, you would say, and 2 of whom are Muslims.
We have publicly spoken out with regard to those candidates' views. But I don't believe those views are shared by the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Certainly you have seen no change in Congress when it comes to U.S. military aid to Israel or any of the other votes that are taken that are certainly a test in terms of support of Israel. Democrats and Republicans continue to strongly support Israel in Congress, and we've seen absolutely no change. So when those 3 women are likely elected, and they likely will be, we agree on that, I think they will be moved to the center on these issues as opposed to moving the party to the left.
Huh, interesting. That they may show up at APAC conferences and not as keynote speakers.
I didn't say that.
I know that.
I don't believe that the Democratic Party is going to move to the left because 3 candidates may hold views that are outside the mainstream.
She may be right. I mean, this is the ultimate in extreme. I mean, nobody, neither Kamala Harris nor Cory Booker nor even Sanders are moving quite in the direction of those 3 candidates. These are 3 congressional candidates that might just be in the House, and they may be marginalized, or they might actually change and become more moderate.
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree that the Democratic Party is not going to change because of 3 congressional candidates. The Democratic Party is going to change because its electorate is changing. I believe that we're now down to just under half of Democrats supporting Israel, slightly more are anti-Israel in one form or another. You've got Democrats, I mean, what you have in these 3 candidates is people who are proud of saying they're anti-Israel because they believe that it burnishes their human rights credentials. This is a view that is now acceptable within the Democratic Party. You've got, I mean, this is what is changing the party. And part of it has to do with the fact that the Jewish Democrats were never interested in fighting for their party. They were never, as the issues changed over the past 10, 15, 20 years, as you would expect they would, I mean, the issues are going to change, the Jewish Democrats have not gone into their party and said, you know, this is too far. You support these people, you lose us. We're not going to donate money. We're not going to vote for you. Some of them have. There are more Jewish Republicans now than there were 15 years ago. I'm one of them. You know, but you've got parties changing, and the Democrats are changing in a way that is detrimental to Jewish interests. The one vote, I am not, by the way, I am not somebody who believes that there needs to be Jewish unity on many issues. I don't really care whether other Jews agree with me on taxes, on the environment, on any of these things. The security of Israel, the continued security of Israel as a Jewish state, is something on which there should be Jewish unity. And I have never seen a vote that was so clearly opposed to that than the one on the Iran deal.
Right.
And I mean, this was, you know, if you want a litmus test, if you are concerned with the future security of the state of Israel, you oppose a bill that every major political party in Israel says is an existential threat. That's not rocket science. The Democrats couldn't do it. Some of them did. Most of them did not.
Halie, you've touched on this already, but I want to, and you're going to think, why are you asking me this question? But I think it would be interesting to have you respond to this. By all accounts, President Trump has made some decisions in 2 years that are extraordinary from the perspective of pro-Israel people, right? The embassy move, for sure. The rejection, withdrawal, cancellation of the Iran deal. The honest, I would argue, the honest, tough talk to Palestinians. No one ever really, until recently, spoke to them honestly. Everyone was always upset, too concerned with hurting their feelings. Now we're actually talking to them honestly. Do you want a state or do you want to be a terrorist group? Which is it? It's time for you to decide. And if not, we won't talk to you. If you don't want to come to the table, fine. We'll talk to other countries, right? This kind of thing just simply didn't happen certainly during the Obama administration. What's happened in the United Nations is extraordinary, right? In terms of withdrawing from UNESCO, the United Nations Human Rights Council. Again, putting the world on notice. We are aware of the double standard that you're holding Israel to, and we don't like it, and we're taking names. But you've also said that despite that, the numbers are overwhelming. Jewish voters still are rejecting President Trump. And I will tell you, I don't only fill in for Mark Golub occasionally. I do these events. I have another job where I do these events on stages around New York. And I had once Eric Cantor years ago when he was in office, and he was the head of led the majority party in Congress. And he said it was astounding to him that with the kind of support Republicans give Israel every year, why, and he described it as more, 80%, no matter what. You can't move the needle. 8 out of 10 American Jews will vote the Democrats no matter what. Even with the Iran deal, right? Even with, the frosty relationship between Netanyahu and Obama, it just didn't matter. Do you understand, can you explain why this is true, that even here, I'm sure President Trump is shocked. He would think to himself, every Jewish person should be voting for me.
I can definitely explain this. The
Please.
fact of the matter is, there's a misconception that Jews are supportive of Trump's foreign policy, even as it relates to Israel. And don't take my word for it. Again, there are facts to prove this. Part of the poll looked at the intricacies of Trump's foreign policy with regard to the Middle East, and 70% disagreed with the withdrawal from the Iran deal. 56% disagreed with the way Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and 62% disapprove of how Trump has handled the relationship with the Palestinians. And the notion that he's talking to the Palestinians may be correct, but they're not speaking back. There's no communication between this administration and the Palestinians. And I don't know that that's good for anyone, whether it's the United States or Israel. But the fact of the matter is, the Jewish community overwhelmingly does identify with Israel. 92% of those polled view themselves as pro-Israel. But the reason they're voting for Democrats is because they also think the Democratic Party is pro-Israel. And Trump's policies on Israel have not won Republicans any support in the Jewish community. And I would go even further to say that his domestic policies in particular have lost him support from the Jewish community.
So Bruce, for you, is what Halie said utterly irreconcilable? How can someone call themselves pro-Israel Democrat and not support some of these positions, or what she would describe, the polling is clear that in the very things that I identified, all the things I listed, she's saying, well, the polling actually shows that American Jews don't actually agree that those are positive developments, that maybe Bruce does, but most Democratic Jews do not.
Well, I think you've got two issues here. One is that the progressives have been very successful at redefining terms. You've got groups out there like J Street that have spent a decade now redefining what it means to be pro-Israel. So you've got people who belong to J Street, which is a rabidly anti-Israel organization. It is pro-Palestinian, and it calls itself pro-Israel. So the labels don't necessarily mean anything. As I've said before, I've never met an American, any political party, I've never met an American who considered himself proud to be a racist. But when half the country, that sounds like a point of agreement, but when half the country thinks Black Lives Matter is an anti-racist organization and half thinks it's a racist organization, it's not clear to me what the agreement means. I think that Jews do not like to describe themselves as anti-Israel. I think they support positions that are anti-Israel. But I mean, the reconciliation and the answer to the question goes back to something I said earlier. There are really two Jewish voting blocs in this country. One is Americans who are Jewish. They may define themselves as Jewish. They don't define their politics as Jewish. They cannot look at their politics and say, here is an issue that would be uninteresting to me if I were not Jewish, that I have elevated to new importance. They cannot say, here is a position I would take if I were not Jewish, but as a Jew, I'm taking another one. Those people are overwhelmingly urban. They're educated, they're relatively affluent, and they vote like urban, educated, affluent Americans, which means overwhelmingly Democratic. Then you've got Jewish voters who say, look, this is not parochial, this is not special pleading, these are things that I care about. I can tell you, my issues as a Jew, I would be concerned about anti-Semitism if I were not. Much as I am concerned about racism, I would not be as concerned. I would support Israel because it's a great strategic ally that shares American values. I don't know that I'd be as concerned about its Jewish character. And I would worry about freedom of religion as I worry about all of our civil liberties, but I don't think it would be a frontline issue for me. The Jews that have issues, the Jews that are happy and proud to say, here are the issues that are important to me because I'm Jewish, are increasingly Republican.
It might be that polling will continue to show that most Americans, Democratic and Republican, support Israel, and that has been an ongoing, I think it's around 70% usually a favorable opinion of Israel. But I'm wondering within the party itself whether you're concerned that although it's true there's only, we're talking about 3 House seats, but that there might be a fraying, a weakening of the ties between the solid majority of Democratic, not voters, but those that are in the House and the Senate, that might actually fray over time, and that we're seeing glimpses of this, and we're seeing this, of course, in the United Kingdom with the Labour Party. I mean, they're being torn apart by this very issue. Of course, they're experiencing it in a very different way because the nation itself never supported Israel in the same numbers that the United States does, of course. But I'm wondering whether, I'm sure, remember, Bruce started off this response by saying the word progressives, so I thought your head would explode because he's calling you a progressive. But he said,
I will wear that with a badge.
Okay. So, all right. So if you're willing to embrace it, given the fact that there is surely much more, the operative word is nuanced positions on Israel. I'm sure he would say nuance is just another good, it's a fancy word for anti-Israel, right? But I'm wondering whether you do think over time there is a fraying, a dilution of support, or you might say, but it's justified that we have to be more critical of Israel. And before you answer, I also want to say, when I had Debbie Wasserman Schultz on my stage, she said something very different. She said, President Obama is the greatest president Israel's ever had. She said there's even close in terms of close military cooperation, sharing of intelligence, various aid packages, military spending. So, you know, for those people that are worried only about optics, what it looks like versus what the reality is, maybe here there is no reality. That there's a little optics here and there, but Democratic support for Israel is still solid.
I believe that it is solid, and I believe that the majority of Jews are both progressive and are both pro-Israel. Certainly that is where our organization is, and we have not seen that fraying from either party in Washington. Israel continues to be a bipartisan issue, which is what it should be. However, we're deeply concerned about Trump's efforts to politicize this issue. We see it in this election. We saw it with the moving of the embassy, where you have an ambassador, our ambassador to Israel, saying political things, talking about partisan issues, which U.S. diplomats historically have not done. And we're troubled by Israel being used as a political wedge issue in this election because the facts, again, demonstrate that the majority of the Jewish community supports Israel and supports the Democratic Party. They care about Israel, but they know that Democrats also do. So there's no concern. Therefore, they're voting on domestic issues where there is an extreme fissure between the Democratic and Republican parties, and they're voting for Democrats because they reject Trump.
Now, is what Halie said fighting words for you, Bruce? Because in a way, what she's describing is saying, look, you know, even the embassy move is not something that we would support.
I didn't say that.
But you were saying
I didn't say that.
The politicized comments that came out of the
ambassador.
I think
most Jews, certainly the Jewish Democratic Council, agrees that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
But that may not be that you should. Many Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, every 6 months, as we know, they renewed whatever it was necessary to avoid having to actually move the embassy. Now the embassy was moved. I do know that many Democratic analysts thought it was a mistake. And it would not surprise me if you said, look, Israel's capital is clearly Jerusalem, but I don't think we needed, the embassy move was not essential. That was a political move. And I'm not sure if that's what you are saying.
It was the lack of strategy that was troubling for most American Jews. I believe that is why we saw 56% disapproved of the way Trump moved the embassy. But also after, we saw an erratic policy from the president saying that Israel would pay a heavy price for moving the embassy. How are we to square these things? There's this misconception that somehow he did this in what he believed was Israel's interest, but then to say Israel would pay a heavy price just demonstrates the incoherence of his policy, and that's what American Jews are rejecting.
You should have the last word on this. We'll give you an opportunity to,
Sure.
in many ways, defend the many things, the various things that Halie is saying. Look, you know, this, what might be perceived as very strong pro-Israel policy is riddled with conflict and problems and inconsistencies and a lack of strategy, and that we should not immediately hail. Remember, in Israel, they're naming a train station after him. So the Israelis seem to adore this man, but Halie is describing again more nuanced, a much more thoughtful way of thinking about how these strategies were implemented and whether they were thoughtful and engineered properly.
Well, first of all, I think that there is a completely coherent strategy. I think that the national security strategy that the Trump administration came out with last December was a beautiful document that actually explains everything that he's been doing abroad. Second of all, I think that I want to go back to Haley's actual answer, where the first thing she said was, "Don't politicize this." Neither political party has ever encouraged people not to politicize an issue that serves their interest. The reason she's saying don't politicize it is because if you actually take a look at this issue and you look at the difference between the parties and you are pro-Israel, you vote Republican. That's why the Democrats don't want it politicized. Now, I have to tell you, I would like to see a competition. Okay? I would like it if the Democrats came and said, "Ha, you think that Trump is pro-Israel? We'll show you what a pro-Israel agenda looks like." They haven't, because that's not where the party is. It is, I mean, I would like, maybe this isn't the right thing to say as a Republican strategist.
We'll air it anyway.
No. As a Jewish voter, our community would be best served if a third of us were hardcore Republicans, a third of us were hardcore Democrats, and the other third sat in the middle and said, on an election-by-election basis, we'll see who's offering more of interest to our community, and we'll shift our vote. We'll shift our vote accordingly. It's not just the Jews, by the way. That's true for any community that sees itself as a community. President Trump's approach to the Middle East has been coherent. It's been strategic. It's been hugely different from President Obama's strategy. President Obama looked at the Middle East and he decided that the groups with whom he wanted to work were the Muslim Brotherhood on the Sunni side and the Islamic Republic of Iran on the Shiite side. I think those were terrible choices, but that was his strategy and that guided it. President Trump has made different choices. He said he wants to see strong sovereign nations that stand up for their own interest, and that's who he's working with.
All right, that's it for today. I want to thank both Bruce and Halie for being insightful and entertaining guests. It was a really great program, very stimulating, and gives us all a lot to think about with this upcoming midterm elections. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on this midterm election special on JBS. It's always a pleasure spending time with you. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. Keep watching JBS. If you're watching anything else on TV or cable, you're really missing the show. Take care.